Coppola would come out of the rushes with a long face. He was never satisfied, so he was always searching and always, going after something.
Robert Duvall has never been the kind of actor to sugarcoat his opinions or engage in the Hollywood game of diplomacy. In a town where red carpets and interviews are often filled with backslapping, handshaking, and rehearsed flattery, Duvall has been different for his unflinching candor. To him, acting isn't a glamorous profession or an otherworldly transformation. It is an art, a blue-collar labor in spirit, as demanding and disciplined as carpentry or stonework. That philosophy, uncompromising and direct, has made him not just one of the most admired actors of his generation, but one of its most vociferous critics. And when he directed his criticism at peers, co-stars, or directors whose work he felt betrayed the integrity of the craft, the fireworks were incendiary. From iconic legends Marlon Brando and Robert De Niro to influential directors Stanley Kubrick and David Fincher, Duvall left no stone unturned when expressing his contempt when he believed the work and respect for actors was being jeopardized. Below is an in-depth look at his 6 most notorious feuds, each which not only exhibits the tension, but also the very ideology that influenced Robert Duvall's illustrious career. Marlon Brando, the actor's nemesis. Upon its release in 1972, The Godfather left audiences awestruck with its grandeur, masterful direction by Francis Ford Coppola, and a cast that gave performances that would never be forgotten. At the heart of it all was Marlon Brando as Don Vito Corleone, a character that would change his legacy and earn him an Academy Award. But while others praised Brando's work as legendary, one man who was standing alongside him on location was silently taking notes and silently losing faith. That man was Robert Duvall. Duvall's contempt for Brando was not born of jealousy. To the contrary, he had long admired Brando's realism in the early days of his own career. What bothered him was how Brando conducted himself on set, the pranks, the embarrassments, the lack of preparation. Brando, at this stage in his career, notoriously refused to memorize dialogue, instead using cue cards secreted on the set, at times taped to other actors' bodies. For Brando, it was a method of preserving the spontaneity, originality, and unpredictability of his performance. But for Duvall, it was laziness masquerading as brilliance. He did admit once that he even briefly attempted the technique, only to rapidly discard it, realizing that spontaneity actually grew out of knowing one's lines rather than dodging them. More disturbing to Duvall than the cue cards themselves was Brando's treatment of newer actors. Legends circulated that Brando would willfully demoralize them, sabotaging the scenes if he wasn't the focus of attention. For Duvall, this was not the brilliance of a mastermind, it was selfishness that undercut the collaborative ethos of movie-making. Years later, for the 50th anniversary of The Godfather, Duvall let loose in an interview calling Brando an actor's enemy and damning his behavior as destructive. Brando never replied, of course. He died in 2004, but his silence was appropriate. The two actors were opposites of acting philosophy. Brando the wild rebel, and Duvall the careful craftsman. Stanley Kubrick, the director who strangled actors. If Brando was an actor's enemy among actors, then Stanley Kubrick earned the same nickname among directors in Duvall's opinion. The two men had a feud, but it was strange in one way. The pair never worked together. Nonetheless, Duvall did not require first-hand experience to tell him what he thought of Kubrick's infamous directing method. Testifying at a roundtable in 2010, Duvall did not hesitate to answer questions about directors he respected or hated. He flatly stated Kubrick an actor's enemy, deeming his approach manipulative and cruel. Proof? The acting in such classics as The Shining and A Clockwork Orange. To the public, these were such seminal films, full of intensity and unforgettable roles. To Duvall, they were empty, over-manipulated byproducts of a process that annihilated truth. Terrible performances, he stated quite unreservedly. Perhaps great movies, but terrible performances. What angered Duvall was Kubrick's compulsion to take after take, sometimes 70, sometimes hundreds, until actors were shorn of instinct. For Duvall, The heart of acting was in the initial takes when spontaneity was still there. Beyond that, he felt the spirit of the performance perished. Kubrick naturally had his apologists. He maintained that the actors would show up unprepared and that repetition was required to incinerate calculation and be left with raw emotion. But nonsense to Duvall. He was a believer in preparation, discipline, and faith. If a director couldn't get what he required in 3 takes, Duvall felt, then the fault lay not with the actor, but with the director. The conflict was less personal than metaphysical. Duvall admired Kubrick's craftsmanship as a director, but despised his contempt for the actor's craft. To him, Kubrick used actors like props, not as partners. And for Duvall, that was inexcusable. Henry Hathaway, A Conflict on True Grit. By 1969, Robert Duvall was gaining ground in Hollywood, selected to portray the outlaw Ned Pepper in Henry Hathaway's True Grit. But what should have been a career highlight soon became one of the most antagonistic experiences of his career. Hathaway was old-fashioned, a golden age Hollywood director who adhered to authority, discipline, and obedience on set. His method was autocratic, his instructions curt. For young, method acting and trueness immersed actors like Duvall, Hathaway's instructions came across as smothering. The tension came to a boil when Hathaway issued what Duvall felt were ridiculous orders. "When I call action, tense. God damn you." Hathaway shouted. For Duvall, this was the opposite of genuine acting. You didn't manufacture tension, you discovered it naturally. The conflicts became heated, and eventually the shoot became filled with squabbles between the 2 men. Their brawl increased so much that even John Wayne himself, star of the movie and Hollywood icon, had to step in. Accounts indicate Wayne threatened to hit Duvall in the face if he didn't leave Hathaway alone. For Wayne, who was all about professionalism and slick productions, Duvall's tantrums were unproductive. The film went on to win Wayne his sole Academy Award. But for Duvall, the experience was one that left a bitter taste that endured for decades. Decades later, quizzed about Hathaway, Duvall refused even to speak about him offhand with a brusque, "We won't talk about him." Silence was louder than words. Bruce Beresford, the dictator on Tender Mercies, where Hathaway embodied the old Hollywood autocrat, Bruce Beresford embodied a contemporary variant, fastidious, perfectionistic, and not to be swayed. Working with him on Tender Mercies in 1983, Duvall produced the paradoxical result. The Max Sledge, a fallen country star in search of redemption, role earned Duvall his sole and only Best Actor Oscar. Off-camera, however, was an existence of perpetual tension. Duvall resented Beresford's strict control. He yearned for the ability to explore, improvise, and live in the skin of his character. Beresford, meanwhile, scripted every scene to the last detail. Duvall summed up his frustration succinctly. "He has this dictatorial way of doing things with me that just doesn't cut it. Man, I have to have my freedom." The fights grew so intense that Beresford allegedly stormed off the set at one point and threatened to walk out on the film entirely. Duvall, seeing the production on the verge of disintegration, flew out to patch things up. Even though they completed the film and gained critical success, the rapport never completely recovered. Duvall would go on to name-check Beresford as an instance of a director whose approach stifled him, evidence that even Oscar-winning performances could be products of creative unhappiness. David Fincher, the tyrant of endless takes. To Robert Duvall, David Fincher was part of the new generation of directors who, in his opinion, confused obsession with artistry. Infamous for requiring dozens of takes, at times over 100, Fincher was very much of Kubrick's cloth. To Duvall, it was nothing but micromanagement, failure to trust actors to get it done. Rumors circulated that Duvall had been considered for a role in Say 7 but declined, not because of scheduling as he initially claimed, but because he couldn't stomach Fincher's methods. 50 takes, that's not directing, that's torture, Duvall quipped in one interview. You're not finding truth, you're sanding it down until it's dead. Fincher, for his part, responded with surprising grace. Bob Duvall is a national treasure, he replied when queried about the criticism. He should work the way he wants to work. But me, I think the truth comes after the repetition. For Fincher, repetition was a means of peeling away artifice and arriving at something raw. To Duvall, it was just smothering. The two actors never collaborated, and presumably never will, but their silent rivalry is a philosophical confrontation between instinct and accuracy, fire and ice. Robert De Niro, The Myth versus The Craft. Maybe the most astonishing of Duvall's grievances was his tacit disdain for Robert De Niro. The two co-starred in The Godfather Part 2, but the years revealed Duvall's distrust of De Niro's ballyhooed method. While De Niro became famous for dramatic makeovers, putting on weight, shaving his head, learning accents, Duvall perceived something insincere beneath the gesture. "He's good at playing Italians," Duvall once quipped dryly, a remark that bore the sting of dismissal. To Duvall, De Niro embodied a style of acting that was too dependent on external change and insufficiently dependent on the inner truth discovered in silence and listening. As De Niro became the figure of intense performances in Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and Goodfellas, Duvall continued with small, modest roles in movies such as The Apostle and Get Low. He felt De Niro could become a caricature of himself, especially since his subsequent career turned toward more light-hearted comedies and hyperbolic mob characters. De Niro, for his part, never retaliated. He made only a restrained, diplomatic reply, labeling Duvall a serious actor and admitting that they merely had different energies. But underlying the courtesy lay a chasm of philosophy. Duvall believed in simplicity, in honesty unadorned. De Niro believed in transformation, in losing himself in characters through surface means. Both men left lasting impressions on films, but in Duvall's mind, only one road led to truth. Conclusion: The Last Honest Man. Ultimately, Robert Duvall's grievances were never petty. They were the products of a man who passionately believed in the integrity of his profession. His condemnations of Brando's indolence, Kubrick's despotism, Hathaway's dictatorial directorial approach, Beresford's obstinacy, Fincher's micromanaging, and De Niro's histrionic excess were all based on the same conviction: acting is sacred. It is not a venue for ego, for tricks, or for abuse. It is about preparation, discipline, and respect for the character, for the audience, and for fellow actors. Duvall's tone is not only the reviewer recalls, but also the in-your-face honesty with which he stood up for his doctrine. In a Hollywood where everyone else bites their lips, Robert Duvall said whatever he wanted to say, whatever the cost. And if you don't agree with him, that candor is as precious and as scarce as the performances that have made him a legend.